The African savanna stretched endlessly under a molten sky. The air shimmered with heat, the kind that seemed to blur the line between earth and heaven. Acacia trees stood scattered like lonely sentinels, their umbrella-like canopies casting fragile patches of shade over cracked, thirsty soil. Dust swirled lazily in the faint wind, carrying with it the scent of dryness and the whisper of an oncoming struggle. At the heart of this sun-baked wilderness moved a figure of silent majesty, Maru the giant, the leader, a male elephant who had walked these lands for over 6 decades, old enough to remember rivers that had long since dried, grasslands that had turned to desert, and watering holes that existed now only in the stories of elders. Maru's massive frame was weathered like the land he ruled. His skin, grey and creased with deep wrinkles, carried the scars of battles passed against predators, against rivals, and against the merciless forces of nature itself. His tusks, long and slightly curved, bore chips and scratches like trophies of survival. But it was his eyes, small, dark, and clouded with the faint haze of age, that told the truest story. Eyes that had seen births and deaths, abundance and famine, peace and chaos. That evening, the horizon glowed a deep, burning orange as the sun sank lower. His herd moved in a loose formation behind him, dusty silhouettes trailing along the ancient game path. Calves trotted beside their mothers, their oversized ears flapping, their curious trunks swaying clumsily. Young bulls lingered at the edges, practicing mock charges at shadows. The matriarchs kept a vigilant eye on the little ones, occasionally rumbling low in their throats, a language of reassurance that only elephants understood. Maru's pace was slow but deliberate. Every step was a choice, every turn of his massive head a decision. For weeks, he had been guiding the herd toward a place he knew well, a watering hole that had sustained them through many dry seasons. It was the kind of place a leader never forgets, a lifeline etched into memory. But when they crested the last low rise and the herd saw the hollow below, a heavy silence fell over them. Where once there had been shimmering blue water, there was now only a crater of cracked mud, fissured like the skin of the land itself. No reeds, no ripples, no life. The air above it was heavy and still, as if mourning the loss. A calf squealed, confused. Another stumbled, too exhausted to keep up with its mother's anxious pace. The mothers nudged their young toward the hollow out of habit, but their trunks found only dust. The older elephants rumbled uneasily, the sound rolling across the dry basin like distant thunder. Maru stood at the edge of what used to be life itself. He lifted his trunk, inhaling deeply, tasting the air for the scent of water. Nothing. Only the dry metallic tang of dust and the faint trace of animals that had left days ago in search of something better. His ears shifted slightly at the far-off cry of a hornbill, but he did not move. In that moment, he was still carved into the earth, like an ancient statue. The herd looked to him. They always had. Even now, when his steps were heavier and his breath slower, they trusted him to know what to do. That trust was a weight heavier than his tusks. But Maru had carried it all his life. He closed his eyes. In the darkness behind them, memories came not as images, but as sensations. The smell of wet earth after the first rains, the cool kiss of mud against hot skin, the low, contented rumbles of elephants drinking deeply under a starlit sky, and above all, the voice of his mother, deep and steady, guiding him when he was young. Her voice had led him once along a path few knew existed, a path that ended at a secret oasis, a place hidden far from the usual migratory routes, known only to the oldest of the herd. When he opened his eyes again, there was no hesitation. The path was still there. In his mind, he could trace every twist and turn, every landmark etched into the memory of his youth. It was far, perhaps too far for the calves. The journey would be long, dangerous, and without certainty, but it was the only hope they had. The wind picked up, carrying with it a taste of emptiness. Maru rumbled low, a sound that vibrated through the earth, through bone and blood, until every member of the herd stilled and listened. It was not a sound of fear, nor of despair. It was a call to move, a call to trust. The calves huddled close to their mothers. The young bulls fell into line, restless energy replaced by the awareness of the moment's gravity. The matriarchs moved to the center, forming a protective wall around the weakest. Maru took one last look at the hollow. A grave for water, a warning carved by the sun itself. Then, with a slow, deliberate step, he turned southeast, toward the path his mother had shown him so long ago. The herd followed. Dust rose around their feet like a shroud. The sun sank fully behind the horizon, leaving the savannah bathed in the deep purple of twilight. And somewhere in the darkness ahead, hidden beyond the reach of the stars, lay a place of life or perhaps death. Only the journey would decide. In the vast emptiness of the savannah night, the legend of Maru, the elephant, took its next breath, and the first chapter of his final journey began. The first night on the new path was heavy with silence. The African savannah, so fierce and relentless under the day's sun, had turned into a vast, cool expanse under the weight of 1,000 stars. The heat radiating from the cracked earth began to fade, replaced by a breath of night wind that tasted faintly of dust and the distant, dry perfume of acacia leaves. Crickets started their endless chorus. Somewhere in the distance, a hyena's uneven laugh cut through the stillness, sharp and mocking, before fading back into the dark. The herd was quiet, moving in a slow, disciplined line. Their massive silhouettes glided over the pale sand, moonlight tracing silver edges along their wrinkled hides. The calves stayed close to their mothers, little shadows darting in and out of the adults' longer steps, their small trunks brushing against reassuring legs. The young bulls at the back kept glancing into the darkness, restless, their ears twitching at every sound. But at the very front, there was only stillness in motion. Maru, the old bull, leading without hesitation. He had been walking this land for more than 60 years. Each step now was slower than in his youth, but it carried the weight of a lifetime's knowledge. He knew the rhythms of the wind, the language of the ground under his feet, the shape of the land, even when the darkness hid it from sight. And tonight, as the moon cast long shadows across the savannah, something deep within him stirred a memory older than many of the elephants in his care. It came like a whisper, carried on the night air. Not a sound exactly, but a pull. The kind of thing that lives in bone and blood. Maru closed his eyes briefly as he walked. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he was no longer the old leader with worn tusks and clouded eyes. He was a calf again. His legs were small and unsure, his skin unscarred, his heart still learning how to beat in time with the great herd. His mother was there, walking just ahead, her vast shadow a moving wall of safety. Her scent was a mixture of sun-warmed hide and the faint mineral temps of mud. He remembered how she would pause, press her trunk to his back, and urge him forward when his tiny legs grew tired. That was the year the rains had failed. The rivers shrank to threads, and the grass turned brittle beneath their feet. Many in the herd had not survived that dry season. But his mother, she had led them to water. Not just any water, an oasis so well hidden that even the wind seemed to keep it secret. The journey had been long, dangerous, and unknown to all but her. She had told no one of the path, until the moment came when there was no other choice. And now, decades later, Maru knew with cold certainty, the moment had come again. He opened his eyes, the moonlight caught in the curve of his tusks, glinting like a promise. The memory of that path was still inside him, as clear as if it had been carved into his very bones. The 3 markers his mother had taught him so long ago rose in his mind like beacons. The tree, a baobab with a crown shattered by lightning, its scar running pale and smooth down the trunk like a river of stone. The ridge, a sandstone formation shaped like a lion lying down, one paw outstretched toward the horizon. The wind, a canyon where the air sings at dusk, the last landmark before water. If he could find them again, he could find life. He rumbled low, a sound too deep for human ears to catch, but strong enough to pass through the earth itself. The herd slowed, heads turning toward him. The matriarchs moved closer, sensing his decision. They didn't need words. In the silence between heartbeats, the message was understood. We go to the old path. The pace changed. No longer the aimless wandering of a herd searching for luck, but the steady, purposeful march of those who have a destination. The young bulls stopped their restless weaving and fell into line. Calves pressed even closer to their mothers, as if they too sensed the gravity of this journey. Hours passed. The night wrapped around them like a dark river, flowing quietly except for the soft thud of massive feet and the occasional shuffle of brush as they passed. Maru led them off the familiar trail, angling toward the southeast where the first marker waited. He could feel the weight of the decision on his shoulders, not just the distance they would need to cover, but the dangers between here and there. In the cool hours before dawn, the ground began to change. The hard, cracked clay gave way to loose sand underfoot. The scent of the air shifted to carrying a faint trace of something once wet. They had reached an old riverbed, now just a pale scar across the land. Maru knew it well. He had seen it in its glory, swollen with rainwater, alive with frogs and dragonflies. Now it was silent, its only gift the smooth, easy path it offered through the savannah. They followed the curve of the riverbed for miles, until Maru signaled a halt beneath a stand of fever trees. Their pale trunks glowed ghostly in the moonlight. The herd gathered close in their shade, resting without lying down, conserving strength. Calves leaned into their mother's legs, eyelids drooping. The matriarchs took turns standing watch. Distantly, hyenas called again, but none dared to approach a herd this size with a leader like Maru at the front. He didn't sleep. Leaders seldom do, not when the weight of lives rests on their choices. Instead, he moved to the edge of the stand and looked out over the riverbed, the faint light of dawn just beginning to wash the horizon in pale silver. He thought again of his mother, of the night they had stood at the foot of the first marker, the broken-crowned baobab. That was where she had paused, touched her tusk to the earth, and told him, "When you see this tree, you are on the road to salvation." As the first sunlit glow touched the fever trees, Maru decided it was time to move again. The herd obeyed without question. They moved through the thinning trees, following Maru's shadow across the pale sand. The morning air was cool, and they covered ground quickly. By mid-morning, the heat began to rise. Waves of it shimmered over the plain, distorting the horizon. The calves began to flag, their steps slower. The adults adjusted pace, keeping the young ones in the center where they were shielded from the worst of the sun. Then just when the heat seemed unbearable, the shape appeared. At first it was only a smudge against the bright sky, but as they drew closer, the details sharpened. A massive baobab, its trunk wide as a house, its crown jagged and broken where lightning had once struck. The pale scar ran down its side, a stark reminder of the power that had shaped it. It stood alone in the open plain, an ancient sentinel watching over nothing but dust and sky. The herd slowed as they approached. Even the calves seemed to sense its importance, their eyes wide, ears fanning the hot air. Maru stopped at its base, lifting his trunk to touch the rough bark. For a long moment, he stood there, the memories flowing through him. This was the first marker. The old path was real, and somewhere beyond the horizon lay the second and the third. Behind him, the herd waited, silent. The air shimmered. A lone vulture circled high above, its shadow flickering over the ground. Maru turned his head toward the southeast, toward the lion-shaped ridge he had last seen as a young bull. His muscles ached. His body told him to rest, but there was no rest yet. The journey had only just begun, and every step from here on was a step deeper into the unknown. With a deep rumble, he began to walk again. The herd followed. The baobab watched them go, the scar on its trunk glowing faintly in the sunlight, like a promise, or a warning. The sun climbed quickly that morning, shedding the cool grace of dawn and replacing it with a white, merciless glare. By the time the broken-crowned baobab was a shrinking silhouette behind them, heat waves were already shimmering above the plain, turning the horizon into a restless mirage. Maru kept his pace steady but careful. Every step in this heat was a withdrawal from the body's hidden reserves. The calves were still fresh from a night's rest, their movements playful at first, but the adults knew the truth. Playfulness on a day like this could be the difference between life and collapse. Slowly, the younger ones fell in line, their ears drooping, their small trunks brushing the dusty ground. By mid-morning, the land began to change. The flat openness gave way to low, rolling rises. Here and there, thorn bushes jutted from the ground, their branches twisted into cruel hooks. Small lizards darted between shadows. The air was still heavy. Even the birds had gone quiet. Maru knew this terrain. He had walked it many seasons ago, back when his tusks were smoother, his legs stronger. There was water here, once seasonal pans that would hold rain for weeks, but they would be dry now. What concerned him wasn't thirst. It was the smell, faint at first, riding on a warm current from the east. A musk, sharper than antelope, heavier than zebra, predators. He slowed, ears lifting, trunk raised to taste the air. The scent confirmed his worry. Lion, not one or two, but a pride. The herd reacted to his shift in posture. Before they even saw the danger, the matriarchs moved inward, tightening their circle around the calves. Young bulls drifted to the flanks, ears wide, muscles tense. The calves stilled, sensing the change. There was no panic, only the heavy silence of preparation. The first lion appeared as a ripple of movement along the ridge to the east. A female, golden coat blending with the grass, head low. She was not alone. Shadows moved behind her, half hidden by the terrain. Then another lioness appeared to the south, blocking the direct path forward. They were not in a hurry. This was not a chance meeting, it was an ambush. Maru stood tall, his silhouette massive against the open sky. He stepped forward, placing himself between the pride and his herd. His ears spread wide, catching the light, making him seem even larger. The deep rumble that rolled from his chest was not for the lions, it was for the elephants behind him. A reminder, I am here, stay together. The lionesses held their distance, pacing slowly, eyes fixed on the calves hidden behind the wall of grey bodies. They knew better than to attack a full-grown elephant. But hunger makes predators bold, and lions are patient strategists. They began to circle, one moving wide to the north, the others shifting subtly to close the herd's rear. Maru understood their game. If they could separate a calf from its mother, just for a moment, the outcome would be fatal. He stepped forward again, his pace deliberate, heavy enough to make the ground tremble. The lioness to the east paused. Her tail flicked a sign of irritation. Another low rumble came from Maru, this one deeper, edged with threat. His head dipped slightly, tusks gleaming like white scythes in the sunlight. Then, without warning, the lioness in the south made her move, rushing low, dust exploding around her paws. The herd reacted instantly. Mothers pressed their bodies tight against their calves. Young bulls charged sideways, trumpeting loud enough to split the air. Maru lunged forward, closing the distance in seconds. The lioness saw him too late. A wall of muscle and fury bore down on her. She swerved, claws tearing the earth, but Maru's tusk caught her flank in a glancing blow. She stumbled, then retreated with a guttural snarl, vanishing into the grass. The other lions froze, their calculated formation shattered. For a long moment, predator and prey stared at each other across the heat-shimmering plain. The lions, frustrated, melted back into the ridges. The herd stayed alert, ears scanning, trunks lifted to test the air. Only when the scents began to fade did Maru signal the all-clear with a short, sharp trumpet. The herd moved on, the circle formation loosening but not breaking. The calves pressed closer to their mothers now, the earlier playfulness gone. Daka, the young bull, walked near Maru's flank, eyes still fixed on the ridges. He was learning, as Maru had learned long ago, that leadership was not only about finding water, it was about defending the right to live long enough to drink it. By afternoon, the landscape began to flatten again, the ridges falling away behind them. The wind picked up, bringing with it a faint coolness from the southeast. It carried the dry mineral scent of stone, perhaps the first whisper of the lion-shaped ridge that marked the second waypoint on their journey. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretching long and thin. The herd's pace quickened just enough to take advantage of the cooler air. Ahead, the sky glowed amber, promising another night of travel. As the first stars appeared, Maru allowed himself a moment to glance back. The ridges were far now, and no movement stirred their edges. But he knew the lions would not forget this day. Neither would the herd. Every trial survived made them stronger, but also reminded them how thin the line was between survival and loss. He rumbled quietly, a sound meant only for those who walked beside him. The first trial had come, and they had passed. But the road to the oasis was long, and the hardest tests were yet to come. The morning light did not arrive gently, it struck. It came spilling over the eastern horizon like molten metal, flooding the savannah in a glare so bright it seemed to erase the lines between sky and earth. The air, even in those early hours, felt thick, pressing against skin and lung as if the night had never truly cooled. Maru knew this kind of day, a day when the sun was not just light but a Watan invisible predator that hunted without pause. He felt it in the tightness of the wind, in the silence of birds that normally sang at dawn. Even the insects, restless through the night, had gone quiet. The herd moved in the shadow of his lead. Calves pressed between mothers, their trunks swinging lower than usual. The older cows' ears flapped more often, not to signal but to fan away the heat creeping into their blood. Daka, the young bull, trotted at the edge of the group, his energy still intact but already tempered by the lessons of the past days. Maru walked in deliberate strides, long enough to cover ground, slow enough to conserve strength. They had left the lion-shaped ridge at dawn, the second great marker on the old path. Ahead lay the singing canyon, but the distance was deceptive. Even with the night's progress, they were still half a day away, and the sun was climbing with cruel efficiency. By mid-morning, thirst began to show itself not in loud desperation, but in small betrayals of the body. Calves' ears drooped, steps dragged. A yearling stumbled twice, each time catching itself in the dust. The mothers murmured low rumbles to keep them moving. A matriarch paused once to shade a calf with her massive body, buying it a few moments of cooler air. Maru lifted his trunk, testing the wind. Dry, utterly dry. No scent of water ahead, only the burnt smell of sun-baked earth. His mind moved through the map his mother had given him decades ago, searching for any memory of hidden resources before the canyon. And then it came to him, an old, seasonal riverbed, somewhere to the east of their current path. It would be dry, yes, but if the earth still remembered rain, there might be water buried deep enough to touch. He changed course without hesitation. The herd followed, trusting without question. The ground soon dipped into the pale, sandy bed of what had once been a lively stream. The banks were etched with old erosion scars, like wrinkles in the face of the land. Here Maru could almost smell the memory of water, a faint, mineral temps that clung to the sand. He stopped and gave a low rumble to the nearest matriarch. Her eyes met his. She understood. Without a word, she began to stamp at the sand with the broad, padded sole of her foot. Another matriarch joined, and then a third. They worked in slow, heavy rhythms, punching the crust until it began to collapse into a darker, cooler layer. Calves gathered around, sensing something important, their eyes wide and hopeful. The young bull Daka stepped forward to help, but Maru blocked him with a single shake of the head. This was patient work, not a place for youthful force. Daka retreated, frustrated but obedient. From the far bank, a pair of hyenas appeared, lean shapes with mottled coats, watching silently. They made no move to come closer, but Maru knew their kind. Hyenas had the patience to wait for weakness. High above, vultures traced slow circles, reading the ground the way hunters read a map. The digging continued. After long minutes, a small bruise of dampness appeared at the bottom of the pit. One matriarch scooped a trunkful of the murky liquid and carried it to a calf, releasing the muddy mouthful into the little one's waiting mouth. Another followed suit, and the ritual began. Calves first, then the weakest cows, each sip rationed like treasure. No bull drank, not yet. The sun rose higher. The riverbed became an oven. The hyenas edged closer, not to attack, but to remind the herd that they were there. One barked a sharp, ugly sound, and the calves huddled tighter. Maru did not move toward them, only shifted his body so that his tusks caught the light. The message was clear enough. The hyenas lingered, but they did not cross the invisible line he had drawn. By midday, the heat had reached its peak. The small well in the riverbed gave less and less with each trunkful. One calf, the same yearling that had stumbled earlier, folded its legs and collapsed into the dust. Its mother trumpeted sharply, a note of panic that sliced through the air. The herd wavered on the edge of chaos. Maru moved instantly. He stepped into the center, touching the calf gently with his trunk 3 times, slow and steady. Wake, breathe, stay. He lifted its head with the fork of his tusk, careful not to harm it. The calf's eyes flickered open. Its mother lowered her trunk, blowing warm breath over its face, willing it to rise. The water in the pit was nearly gone. Maru turned away from it, scanning the far bank. His trunk swept low, tasting the air close to the ground. There a pocket of earth that smelled faintly of roots, shaded just enough to hold what the open bed could not. He reared back and struck with his tusks. The ground cracked. He struck again, opening a fissure deep enough for the matriarchs to work. Sand turned to silt, and silt bled into a thin stream of water. Not much, but enough to keep the weakest alive. The yearling drank first, then the smallest calf in the herd, then an old cow whose ribs stood out like the frame of an abandoned hut. The water was dark, tasting of iron and roots, but it was life in liquid form. By late afternoon, the herd had taken all they could without destroying the fragile seep. They rested in the shade of the bank, some standing, others lying down. Calves leaned into their mothers, drifting into short, uneasy sleep. Daka patrolled the rim of the riverbed, glancing often at the hyenas, who had given up and slunk away to find easier prey. When the sun began to sink, Maru rose. His shadow stretched long across the sand. On the far horizon, he could see it now, the canyon's mouth. framed by two pillars of stone, a narrow gap from which evening wind would soon begin to pour. That wind meant shade, and shade meant strength. He rumbled low, calling the herd to their feet. They moved out of the riverbed, leaving behind the shallow wells that would serve small animals after their passing. The sand clung to their feet, whispering as it fell away with each step. As they approached the canyon, the first breath of cool air touched them. It slid over their ears and along their flanks like a promise. The calves perked up, their trunks lifting to taste the change. The adults quickened their pace, the fatigue of the day lifting just enough to carry them forward. Maru glanced back once at the fading line of the riverbed. It had given them just enough to survive the day of thirst. Tomorrow would bring another trial. But tonight, there was wind. And somewhere beyond the canyon, if the old map in his mind still held truth, there would be water. The day's last light bled into the horizon as the herd reached the canyon's mouth. Two towering walls of stone framed the entrance like ancient sentinels, their surfaces carved and smoothed by centuries of wind and flash floods. The narrow gap between them exhaled a steady stream of cool air, and from deep inside came a sound unlike anything the calves had ever heard, a long wavering note that rose and fell, as though the canyon itself was breathing in song. The herd slowed, ears lifting, trunks curling to taste the new scent in the air. It was cooler here, tinged with the mineral sharpness of stone and the faint sweetness of moss hidden in shaded cracks. The calves huddled closer to their mothers, unsure whether to fear or marvel at the strange music. Maru stood at the threshold, his broad shadow merging with the canyon's own. He inhaled deeply, reading the story carried by the wind. No predator scent, no sign of human smoke. The air moved with the even rhythm of a sleeping heart. This was the right moment to pass. With a deep rumble, he signaled the herd forward. The matriarchs closed ranks, forming a protective braid around the youngest, while the young bulls spread to the edges, eyes scanning the walls. Daka, the eager young bull, took the rear, his posture alert but steady, a sign that the lessons of the journey were beginning to take root. They stepped into the canyon. The world changed instantly. The air grew cooler, the light dimmer. Sound folded in on itself, their footfalls echoed against the stone, mingling with the canyon's voice until it was impossible to tell which was herd and which was wind. High above, the strip of visible sky glowed with the first shy stars, framed by rock faces banded in rusty red and deep brown. The walls rose steep and sheer, punctuated with alcoves where swifts darted in and out. In the distance, a pale ribbon of moon hung low, just bright enough to paint silver edges along the canyon rim. The music of the wind shifted as they moved, changing pitch when the passage narrowed or widened, as if the canyon were playing itself like an instrument. Halfway in, Maru caught a new scent, faint but sharp, carrying the musk of predator. Leopard. Unlike lions, leopards hunted alone. They relied on stealth and precision, and this narrow passage was the perfect killing ground. Maru slowed, ears rotating, trunk sweeping low and then high to pinpoint the source. The matriarchs sensed it too, their rumbles tightening into short, clipped notes of warning. Then he saw a dark silhouette moving along the upper ledge, tail flicking in slow, calculated arcs. The leopard's eyes glinted once in the half-light, locking onto the calves. Its movements were measured, deliberate, circling to find a drop point. Maru did not break the herd's pace. Instead, he adjusted his position, placing himself directly under the ledge's edge. His massive shoulders brushed the canyon wall, blocking the leopard's clean path to the herd center. Below, Daka shifted in anticipation, tusks angled upward. The leopard's patience snapped. It sprang, a blur of muscle and claws in for the smallest calf in the middle of the line. But Maru's timing was perfect. He swung his head up, the sheer bulk of his skull meeting the cat mid-air. The impact disrupted the leopard's strike, sending it skidding down the wall. Before it could recover, Daka lunged with a sharp trumpet, his tusks cutting through the space the predator needed to escape. Startled and outmatched, the leopard twisted, hit the ground, and vanished into the shadows. The herd flowed forward without panic. No cries of victory, no wasted movement. Survival on the march was not about glory, it was about conserving strength for the next danger. As the passage twisted deeper, the music of the wind grew stronger. The walls narrowed until the herd could only pass in single file, their bodies brushing the stone. Here, the pitch rose into a high, trembling note that made the calves restless. The adults soothed them with low-frequency rumbles, vibrations that seemed to anchor the young ones to the ground. The sound changed again when they reached a wider chamber. The canyon opened into a circular basin, its floor polished smooth by centuries of floods. The air here swirled in gentle eddies, carrying the scent of rain far upstream. Maru tested the ground with one heavy step solid. He moved into the center, the herd fanning out behind him. Then he felt it, a faint tremor underfoot, almost too small to notice. Another followed, deeper and more resonant. It wasn't the step of an animal. It was the drumbeat of water. Flash flood. The canyon was a funnel, and when rain fell far away, the water came roaring through without warning. The singing wind faltered, its tone rising sharply, as if in alarm. Maru scanned the walls. On the left, a tumble of boulders formed a slanting ramp to a ledge narrow, but high enough to clear the coming surge. He rumbled a command that vibrated through the herd's bones. The matriarchs herded the calves toward the ramp, pushing from behind, guiding from above. Daka positioned himself halfway up, bracing his body to steady the climb. The adults moved in order, weakest first, bulls last. The rumble of water grew louder, the scent of wet clay filling the air. The flood arrived with terrifying speed, a wall of churning brown water, crowned with foam, sweeping into the basin. It hit the far wall and exploded upward, before racing toward the herd. Spray burst into the air, drenching the elephants as they scrambled onto the ledge. Calves squealed, their voices thin against the roar. Maru held the base until the last mother and calf were climbing. The water surged around his legs, pulling at him with invisible hands. With a final push, he mounted the ramp, the flood smashing into the rocks below. A heartbeat later, from the safety of the ledge, the herd watched the basin fill in seconds. The canyon's song was gone, replaced by the deafening voice of the river hissing, booming, snarling around the rocks. In the chaos, droplets of cold water struck their faces, and for the first time in days, the calves tasted something other than dust. They reached with their trunks, drawing in the mist, drinking greedily from the air. The herd huddled close, their bodies a wall of heat against the night chill. The water raged below, carrying branches, debris, even the bleached bones of animals caught unprepared. The roar lasted long into the night, slowly subsiding until the current no longer climbed the walls. When the first pale light of dawn touched the canyon rim, the basin below was calm again. The flood had left behind pools of clear water, still and deep. The herd descended carefully, calves sliding in the damp clay, adults steadying them with trunks and flanks. They drank in silence, each mouthful washing away a layer of the last day's exhaustion. Maru drank last. The water was cold and clean, sliding over his tongue, down his throat, into the aching emptiness in his body. He lifted his head, droplets falling from his tusks, and turned toward the southeast. The old map in his mind whispered its next promise. Beyond this canyon lay the shallow basin where reeds once grew tall. If water had returned anywhere, it would be there. With the herd gathered and rested, Maru led them onward. The wind still hummed faintly behind them, not as a warning this time, but as a farewell. They had survived the night of the singing wind, not just intact, but stronger for it. The morning after the night of the singing wind broke with a softness the herd had not felt in many days. The air was cool and carried the clean scent of washed stone. Dew clung to their skin in delicate beads, slipping down their flanks with every step. Above them, the sky stretched pale blue, the kind of blue that promised a gentler sun at least for a little while. For the first time in nearly a week, the calves' steps were light, their trunks curling playfully toward each other as they walked. Maru led them out of the canyon's embrace and onto open ground. Ahead, the land rolled gently downward into a wide hollow rimmed by low hills. The soil here was lighter, clay mixed with pale silt, and it bore signs of recent life, fresh hoofprints of antelope, the crisp tracks of guinea fowl, and, most importantly, the round, deep impressions of elephant feet. He knew before seeing it that they were close to the basin his mother had shown him so long ago. As they crested a low ridge, the hidden basin revealed itself. It was broad and shallow, a natural clay bowl holding water in a patchwork of pools connected by narrow channels. In the deeper parts, the water shone like dark glass under the morning sun. Reeds clustered in thick islands, their tops swaying gently in the breeze, and around the banks, patches of short grass glimmered with dew. The air was alive with the sound of frogs, the soft whisper of reed leaves, and the occasional flap of a bird's wings. A white stork stood knee-deep in one of the pools, still as a carved figure, watching the ripples for fish. But there was another sound, low, rhythmic rumbles that did not belong to the wind or the frogs. Another herd was already there. Maru halted on the ridge. Below, on the far side of the basin, a group of elephants clustered around the largest pool. They moved in a slow, steady rhythm, drinking, shifting, splashing water over their backs. Calves trailed close to their mothers, and young bulls roamed the edges with restless energy. The wind favored Maru's herd, carrying their scent away from the strangers, giving him time to read the situation. The matriarchs behind him stopped as well, their bodies forming a living wall around the calves. Daka, the young bull, moved instinctively to the right flank, eyes fixed on the unfamiliar shapes below. The basin was large enough for both herds to drink, but only if both leaders agreed. Water, in times like these, was not simply a resource, it was territory. Maru stepped forward, leading the descent toward the basin at a measured pace. Elephants do not creep or skulk. They arrive as they are, but with a kind of deliberate grace that speaks louder than aggression. As they neared the water's edge, one of the cows from the other herd lifted her head. Her ears spread wide, framing her face like great sails catching wind. She was broad across the shoulders, her tusks worn but strong, and one ear carried a deep crescent-shaped notch mark of age and survival. She rumbled low, a sound that carried both challenge and inquiry. Maru answered with his own note, deep and steady, sending his identity across the ground itself. Maru, leader, passing through. The vibrations traveled through the earth, a message for every elephant within range to feel. Her reply came with the weight of a name, Isola, matriarch, watchful, guarding her water. They approached each other slowly, until only a shallow strip of mud lay between them. For a moment, they stood still, massive heads lifted, ears relaxed but alert. Maru could see the intelligence in her eyes, the quick, measuring look that weighed his size, his condition, and the state of the herd behind him. She glanced once toward the calves in his protection, then toward the wide basin, then back to him. Finally, she stepped aside, angling her body in a small but unmistakable gesture. Drink, but share. Maru lowered his head in acknowledgement. The tension that had hovered like heat in the air eased. He rumbled to his matriarchs and they guided the calves forward. The smallest were first to drink, their trunks dipping clumsily into the shallows, sending little arcs of water splashing over their faces. The older cows drank in slow, deep pools, letting the water slide down their throats before spraying it over their backs in cooling showers. Relief shimmered in the air-soft rumbles, the sound of feet shifting in wet clay, the gentle slap of trunks against water. But the basin held dangers that were not political. In the far reeds, two narrow eyes broke the surface. A crocodile, lying still as a log. It watched from the shadow of the plants, its tail barely moving. One calf wandered a little too close to the edge, trunk extended toward a floating leaf. In an instant, the water broke into violenza, a swirl of spray, a flash of armored scales. The calf screamed, a high, desperate sound. Three mothers reacted at once from Isola's herd, one from Maru's. They charged into the shallows, their trunks thrashing, forefeet pounding the water in explosive strikes. The crocodile released its grip and vanished into the deeper pool, leaving only boiling ripples behind. The calf scrambled back to safety, shaking and whimpering, pressed tight against its mother's side. In that moment, between the two herds, an unspoken truth solidified. Against the water's predators, they were not rivals, they were one body. The herds settled again, drinking and feeding in cautious harmony. Maru wandered toward the basin's northern rim, following a faint trickle of water that seeped through the reeds. The ground there felt different, cooler underfoot, with a subtle pressure against his soles that spoke of water trapped just beneath the surface. He traced the source to a dam of woven reeds and mud, built by last season's flood. Behind it, he could feel the weight of water waiting. He set his tusks into the weave and pushed. The reeds groaned, the mud crumbled, and a seam of brown water burst free, spilling into the open. A narrow channel began to form, feeding a second pool away from the main one. Isella, watching from across the basin, sent one of her older cows to help. Together, they widened the gap until water flowed freely, creating a new drinking place where calves could sip without jostling for space. Daka was stationed there soon after, steadying the young ones as they stepped onto the slick clay, guiding them back when they'd had their fill. On the opposite shore, A young bull from Isila's herd, broad-shouldered and brightest, mirrored him. Earlier, the two had exchanged a charged glance, each testing the other's pride. Now, they worked in silent rhythm, moving calves in and out of the pool like seasoned sentries. By midday, the basin had settled into a pattern of shared use. One herd would drink while the other grazed the grass along the banks. Then they would switch. The air was heavy with the smell of damp clay and fresh water. Birds gathered in growing numbers, gibbous, kingfishers, and a solitary fish-eagle that circled high before vanishing into the bright distance. The sun warmed the clay until it was soft underfoot, and the pools reflected the shifting clouds above. But the peace would not last forever. Water draws more than the thirsty. Maru could smell other animals on the wind: zebra, wildebeest, maybe even lions following the migration routes. He knew they could not linger long, no matter how tempting it was to stay. In the late afternoon, clouds began to gather in the west, building into a wall of grey. The air shifted, cooler now, carrying the promise of rain far off. Maru rumbled to the herd, calling them to drink one last time. Across the basin, Isula did the same. The two herds moved without conflict, their paths crossing at the water's edge in quiet acknowledgement. When they were finished, Maru led his herd up the northern slope, choosing a resting place far enough from the water to avoid the night's dangers, but close enough to return at dawn if needed. As the sun dipped, painting the basin in gold and shadow, the two herds parted water between them now, not as a dividing line, but as a shared memory. The hidden basin had given them more than survival. It had offered proof that in the harshest seasons, survival was not always a solitary act. Sometimes, it was a bargain struck without words, a decision to drink side by side instead of alone. Maru lay down in the cooling dust. The calves curled close to their mothers and listened to the frogs' chorus echoing up from the hollow. Beyond this basin, he knew, lay harder ground and harsher choices. But for tonight, under the rising moon, the herd could rest. The next trial could wait for morning. The dawn after the hidden basin came with a warning. The air was still, unnaturally so, as though the wind itself had withdrawn to watch. The horizon lay sharp and distant, edged in a pale shimmer that Maru recognized instantly. Salt. The old map in his bones spoke its next line: beyond this basin. The path to the southeast crossed the great pan, a flat, treeless expanse where the earth was white and the sky was merciless. It was the shortest route to the next known water, but it was also the most dangerous. The pan was deceptive. From a distance, it looked like a calm lake, its surface rippling under the sun. But that shimmer was heat mirage, and the lake was nothing more than baked crust over hard-packed clay, stretching for miles in every direction. There would be no shade, no grass, no relief, only heat, light, and the dry wind that scraped moisture from skin and mouth. The matriarchs knew what was ahead before Maru signaled it. Their rumbles carried the weight of experience to the younger mothers. Keep the calves close. Pace them. Do not let them wander. The herd drank deeply at the basin before first light, filling every stomach, storing what water they could in their bodies. Calves drank until they could hold no more, their bellies round and taut. They began the crossing just as the sun broke the horizon. At first, the air was cool, the ground firm underfoot. The white crust crunched softly with each step, leaving dark, damp impressions that quickly dried and cracked. The pan stretched out like an endless sheet of bone. The only movement was the slow, steady march of the herd, 20 great grey shapes against a landscape so empty it felt like the inside of a bowl. As the sun climbed, the heat began to press down. The light here was different, sharper, harsher, reflecting off the salt in blinding flashes. Waves of heat shimmered ahead, distorting distance, turning the far edge of the pan into a mirage that seemed to recede as they approached. Calves squinted against the glare, their ears drooping. The mothers began fanning their ears in slow, rhythmic movements, pumping blood through the vessels to cool their bodies. By mid-morning, the air felt heavy in their lungs. The ground radiated heat upward, so that each step sent a faint wave of hot air rising from below. The calves began to falter, their pace slowing. One very young calf stumbled, legs splaying awkwardly before its mother steadied it with a gentle push from her trunk. Maru adjusted the formation, pulling the herd into a tighter group. The young bulls moved to the outer edges, shielding the center from the worst of the glare. The pan had its own dangers beyond heat. The surface, though solid in most places, sometimes concealed patches of softer clay where water had once pooled and then evaporated, leaving behind slick, unstable ground. These spots could trap a leg or twist an ankle. Maru guided the herd in a winding path, avoiding the darker, damp-looking patches that warned of weakness beneath the crust. Hours passed. The air seemed to hum with heat. There was no sound of birds here, no rustle of grass, only the soft thud of feet and the occasional low rumble passed between herd members. Even Daka, who had once struggled to keep his energy contained, walked in silence, his head low, his steps measured. By noon, the heat was a living thing. It pressed against their sides, curled into their ears, and crawled down their throats. The calves' trunks hung limp, and their steps dragged. The mothers began taking turns shading the smallest calves, standing over them as they walked, so that the sunlight fell on their own backs instead. Sweat darkened the creases behind their ears, and every breath carried a trace of salt from the crusted ground. Maru could feel the strain in his own body. His legs felt heavier with each step, the tremor in his left foreleg more pronounced. But he did not slow. Too slow was to prolong the trial, and the pan gave nothing back to those who lingered. In his mind, he counted the hours left. If they kept pace, they would reach the far edge by late afternoon, where low, acacia scrub promised shade and the possibility of water within another day's travel. Then came the wind. It began as a whisper, brushing over their flanks, but quickly gathered strength. By the time the sun leaned past its highest point, the wind was driving salt and fine grit across the pan in a stinging sheet. It scoured their skin, filled their eyes, and coated their tongues with bitterness. The calves cried out, pressing against their mother's legs. Maru turned his head away from the gusts and signaled a formation change tighter. Denser bodies angled to break the wind for those in the center. The glare, the heat, and the wind worked together, each stripping away a layer of strength. Maru's ears caught the subtle, too-light rhythm of a calf's steps behind him. He turned slightly and saw a small Wana young female fall behind, her trunk dragging through the salt, her eyes half closed. Without breaking stride, he moved to her side, nudged her gently with his shoulder, and guided her forward until her mother could take over. The herd could not leave anyone behind here. The pan was not a place for the weak to rest. It was a place that took the resting. By late afternoon, the white expanse began to break. The first sign was color-faint patches of brown and green rising from the flat horizon. Then the ground began to slope upward, the crust giving way to harder soil. The air changed subtly, losing the metallic temps of salt and carrying instead the dry, dusty scent of scrubland. When the first acacia tree appeared, it was like a shadow made solid. The herd reached its shade in slow waves, calves stumbling into its meager cover and collapsing in the dust. Mothers stood over them, trunks hanging loose, sides heaving. Maru moved among them, checking each member with a light touch of his trunk head, flank, legs, ensuring none had been injured during the crossing. They had made it. The salt pan lay behind them, an unbroken sheet of white under the evening sun. Ahead, the land rolled toward the next challenge. But for now, there was rest in shade, dry air, and the knowledge that they had crossed one of the most unforgiving places in the world without losing a single member. Maru stood at the edge of the shade, watching the pan. He knew the crossing had taken more than it seemed. The thirst would come tomorrow, sharper and more urgent, and the next leg of the journey would need every drop of strength they had left. But in the silence of that moment, with the wind easing and the herd breathing together in one slow rhythm, he allowed himself the smallest luxury, to close his eyes and feel the weight of survival. The night after crossing the salt pan brought a deceptive calm. The sky was clear, spattered with white stars so sharp they looked close enough to touch. The air cooled just enough to ease the burn from the day's march, and the wind, though faint, carried scents that stirred old instincts in the herd. Dust from dry grasslands, the faint, wet promise of a shallow hollow, and woven through both the thick, musky undertone of predators. Maru caught it first. One breath was all it took for the knowledge to settle deep in his chest. Lions. The calves were sprawled in the dust beneath their mothers, bellies still full from the basin's last gift of water. The young bull Daka stood at the edge of the resting circle, head held higher than usual, scanning the dark horizon. Maru moved to him, their shoulders almost touching, and lifted his trunk into the air. The wind's story was clearer now. Lions lay somewhere ahead, between the herd and the next vital water source. He knew what this meant. The hollow they were aiming for was not just a stop on their map, was also a beacon for every thirsty creature for miles. Lions were no exception. If they were hungry, they would wait there. If they had recently fed, they might still try to take a calf. Even a well-fed lion hunts, if the opportunity is easy enough. The decision came quickly. They would move now, in the last hour before dawn, when the air was still cool enough to keep the calves from overheating, and the predator's eyes were adjusting to the change in light. He rumbled low, sending the signal through the earth. The matriarchs lifted their heads in unison, their bodies shifting into position. Calves were nudged awake, coaxed to their feet, shielded instantly in the tight weave of the herd's formation. The first steps out of the acacia shade were silent but deliberate. Maru led from the front, Daka, and an older bull taking the flanks, the matriarchs forming a moving wall around the youngest. The herd was a slow, grey tide spilling across the pale dust, every member aware of the invisible eyes that might be watching. The land between the salt pan and the hollow was a quilt of thorn scrub, dry gullies, and old termite mounds. It was a hunter's country, places to hide, choke points to force a charge, shadows to swallow the shape of a predator until it was too late. A small band of baboons chattered nervously from a rocky outcrop, their alarm calls flitting ahead of the herd. Maru knew that sound well. It meant movement. It meant patience lying in wait. They reached the edge of a shallow gully, just as the first lioness appeared. She rose from the grass like a ghost, taking form broad-shouldered, her golden coat melting perfectly into the brittle stalks. A long scar ran down her right flank, pale against the muscle beneath. Her head was low, ears flat, eyes locked on the herd center. A second lioness materialized to their left, crouching near a half-toppled termite mound, and then a third, a shape that had been nothing more than a shadow moments earlier, leapt into position on the herd's right flank. It was a coordinated maneuver, old as the Savannah itself. One lioness would rush to scatter the herd, the others would strike from the sides, in the moment of confusion, and behind them, unseen but felt, the rest of the pride would wait to close the circle. Maru did not trumpet. Instead, he grew still, his massive frame radiating a steady, immovable authority. His ears spread wide, catching the light of the fading moon, making him appear even larger. His rumble rolled through the earth beneath their feet, low enough that only those touching the ground could hear its full weight. The herd tightened instinctively, calves pressed into the living fortress of bodies around them. The first move came from the right. The lioness there surged forward, paws silent, body low. Her target was not a calf directly, it was the space between two cows, a gap just wide enough to slip through and reach the vulnerable heart of the herd. But before she could commit, Daka moved. The young bull's reaction was fast, sharper than in weeks past. He stepped into her path, swinging his head low. His tusks caught the faint light, gleaming like pale blades. He didn't gore. He blocked, forcing her to swerve wide and break her momentum. The lioness skidded to a stop, tail lashing in irritation, and melted back into the grass. Almost immediately, the lioness on the left lunged faster, harder, closing the gap before the cows could fully turn. Her aim was a small female calf, barely a year old, trailing half a step behind its mother. The lioness hit the edge of the formation with a burst of dust and muscle. The mother spun, trumpeting so loudly it cut the air like a blade. She swung her head and caught the lioness with the curve of her tusk, not enough to wound deeply, but enough to shove her off balance. Another cow pressed in, her trunk striking the predator's face like a whip. The lioness retreated, ears flattened, calculating the cost of another try. The scarred lioness at the front had been waiting for exactly that distraction. She bolted straight toward the center, her speed terrifying in its precision. Maru moved to meet her, his steps heavy enough to make the ground shiver. They closed the distance in seconds. At the last moment, Maru swung his head upward, his massive brow striking her chest. The impact lifted her front paws clear of the ground. She twisted, landing awkwardly, and backed away with a deep snarl. The herd held its line. The lions regrouped, pacing just out of reach, golden eyes glinting in the low light. A male roared from somewhere farther back, a long, ragged sound that rolled across the grass and into the bones of every creature that heard it. It was not a challenge, it was a promise. "We will try again." Maru did not answer. Instead, he began to move the herd forward, not in a retreat, but in a slow, deliberate push. Each step was a statement. "We are going to the water. You will not stop us." The hollow came into view as the sky began to lighten, a shallow depression, ringed by tall grass, with a fever tree leaning over its southern edge. The water in the center was not much, just a wide pool, the color of dark glass, but in this season, it was life, and it was surrounded. 2 lionesses crouched in the grass to the west, one to the east, and another almost invisible in the reeds near the water's edge. They had chosen their ground well, using the hunger for water to draw their prey into a killing zone. But Maru had no intention of giving them that fight. Instead of walking straight into the trap, he swung the herd wide, approaching the water at an angle that turned their column into a broad wall. The matriarchs fanned out, their tusks forward, their ears spread. 2 older cows strode ahead of the calves, stamping the ground as they went, sending vibrations through the earth efflorescent, warnings that predators understand. One of the lions in the grass shifted, frustrated by the sudden loss of surprise. A calf, momentarily curious, strayed too close to the reeds. The water exploded in motion, not from a lion, but from a crocodile lying in wait. The calf squealed, but before the reptile could clamp down, its mother and aunt were there, smashing the shallows with their feet. The crocodile vanished in a churn of mud and bubbles. The lions watched, waiting for the panic to break the herd's formation. It never came. Calves drank first, their trunks dipping into the dark water, drawing it into their mouths with loud, eager pulls. Mothers followed, spraying themselves to cool the heat from the salt pan crossing. Only when the youngest had finished did Maru step forward. He drank slowly, deeply, the cool water sliding down his throat like relief itself. The lions did not leave, but they did not attack again. They sat in the grass, eyes half closed, waiting for some weakness to appear. It never did. When the herd was done, Maru led them away from the hollow. Before comfort could dull their alertness, they climbed a low rise to the east, where the ground was open and the wind could carry the scent of any approach. There, they formed a crescent with the calves in the center. Daka stood at the front of the formation, his side still marked with the shallow score of claws, but his head high. The night had taken much of their strength, but not their unity. The lions had come close, but they had been met, held, and denied. And as the first rays of sunlight spilled over the land, Maru turned his gaze to the southeast. Somewhere out there, the oasis his mother had once shown him still waited. They would reach it, or they would die walking toward it, but they would walk together. The night after the lion's ambush passed with no further attack, but it was not a restful night. The herd slept lightly, the calves waking often, pressing close to their mothers at the faintest sound. In the distance, lions roared farther away now, their voices rolling across the plains like fading thunder. Each call was an echo of the danger still near. Maru stood for much of the night, silhouetted against the moonlit horizon. His eyes scanned the darkness, while his ears turned slowly, listening to the land breathe. He knew the pride would follow at a distance. The hunger of lions was patient. They had not given up, they had merely lost the night's gamble. By dawn the air was cool but heavy with the smell of dust and coming heat. The wind carried a thread of scent that tugged at Maru's memory, the faint sweetness of damp clay. Somewhere ahead, the old map in his bones whispered, lay the oasis his mother had once shown him. It was the heart of their journey, the place that could mean survival for another season or nothing but dry ground if it had failed. The morning push, they began moving before the sun's rim had cleared the earth. The herd's formation was tight, calves tucked inside the wall of mothers. The matriarchs walked with deliberate pace, balancing speed with the need to conserve strength. Daka and the older bull took the flanks again, eyes alert for movement in the grass. The salt pan crossing and the lion's ambush had drained them, but their discipline held. The land rolled gently now, patterned with patches of yellowed grass and the grey-brown bones of old trees. Every few hundred steps, a lone acacia threw a scrap of shade across the path, too small to matter for the herd, but a reminder that life persisted here, stubborn and quiet. Birds flitted between thorn branches, trongos, starlings, even a pair of lilac-breasted rollers whose colors flashed briefly in the morning light before disappearing into the scrub. By mid-morning, the heat began to press down. The calves' ears drooped, and their steps lost their early rhythm. A small male stumbled, his trunk dragging in the dust. His mother slowed to nudge him forward, her body shielding him from the sun as best she could. The matriarchs adjusted the line to keep the weakest shaded. Maru called a brief halt at a stand of mopane trees, where the leaves hung like green butterfly wings. The herd rested in their shade just long enough for the calves to breathe easier before pushing on. Signs of the oasis. It was near midday when the first clear sign appeared. In a shallow gully, the soil darkened to a rich brown, and a faint trail of moisture had baked into a thin crust on the surface. It was not enough to drink from, but it was proof that water had flowed here perhaps recently. Maru lingered a moment, tracing the gully's direction with his trunk. It pointed southeast, the same bearing etched into him since the journey began. The herd followed the gully for hours, the ground slowly becoming softer underfoot. The air changed, too still dry, but carrying the ghost of something green. The calves began to lift their heads more often, sniffing the wind as if they could taste the promise in it. Then, in the late afternoon, a sound reached them, faint, muffled, but unmistakable, the distant call of water birds. It came again a few minutes later, clearer this time, the sharp cry of an African jacana, followed by the low murmur of doves. The mothers exchanged low rumbles. Even Daka's eyes brightened, but Maru did not increase the pace. He knew too well that water also drew predators. If lions had followed, they could be waiting at the oasis. Hyenas, too, might be there, bold in numbers. Even crocodiles would have claimed the deeper pools by now. The last stretch, the gully deepened as the sun slid toward the horizon, its sides lined with young reeds that whispered in the breeze. The smell of water was strong, now a heavy, mineral-rich scent that coated the back of the throat. The calves grew restless, tugging at their mothers, their rumbling almost impatient. When the herd topped the final rise, the oasis lay before them. It was larger than Maru remembered, its surface broken into several pools by fingers of land and red beds. Fever trees ringed the northern shore, their pale bark catching the gold of the sinking sun. The air hummed with life dragonflies darted low over the water. Weaver birds swung from their grass nests, and in the shallows, fish flickered like quicksilver. But the water's edge was not empty. On the far side, two lionesses lay half in shadow, their bodies stretched and still, golden eyes fixed on the new arrivals. A third crouched near the reeds, almost invisible except for the slow lash of her tail. Farther back, a shape moved bigger, heavier, the mane of a male catching the light. Maru stopped the herd at the ridge. The matriarchs bunched together, the calves pressed tighter into their center. Daka took a step forward, eager, but Maru blocked him with a slow swing of his head. They would not rush in, not yet. The two herds, the elephants and the lions, watched each other across the water. The lions were patient. They had learned the hard way that a united herd could not be broken head-on. They would wait for fatigue, for distraction, for the smallest mistake. The claim. Maru signaled the advance. The herd moved in a wide arc, approaching the water from the east instead of the open shoreline where the lions lay. The matriarchs led with heads high, trunks swinging low to test the air. The calves stayed buried in the wall of adult bodies, shielded on all sides. The first to reach the water were two older cows. They stepped in slowly, stamping the mud, sending ripples across the surface. A crocodile slid away into deeper water, the movement a dark ribbon beneath the surface. The lions watched but did not move. When the water was declared safe, the calves rushed forward, their trunks plunging into the cool surface. They drank in great noisy gulps, some spraying themselves in playful arcs. The mothers drank more slowly, drawing water deep into their bodies, before lifting their trunks to shower it over their backs. Maru drank last. The first mouthful was rich and heavy, tasting of earth and old rain. It slid down his throat and into his belly like a gift. Around him, the herd's breathing slowed, their bodies relaxing for the first time in days. The lions still watched, but they did not act. They knew that this moment, this unity was unbreakable. There would be other nights, other chances, but not now. Nightfall at the oasis. When the herd had finished drinking, Maru led them to a shallow rise just beyond the fever trees. From here, they could see the water and the surrounding grasslands. The breeze was steady, carrying the scent of any approaching predator straight to them. The calves lay down quickly, their bodies warm and damp from the water. Mothers stood over them, their shadows stretching long in the fading light. Daka took the first watch without being told, his eyes fixed on the lion's distant shapes. Maru stood apart for a moment, gazing at the water below. The journey had cost them days of thirst, the crossing of the Pan, the lion's test, but they had arrived. The oasis was real, alive, and theirs for now. In the darkening sky, the first stars appeared. The wind shifted, carrying the soft chorus of frogs and nightbirds. Maru turned back to the herd, his steps slow but certain. They had reached the heart of the map his mother had once walked, and for tonight, at least, they had peace. Dawn over the oasis began with a thin veil of mist, lifting from the cool surface of the water like the breath of the earth itself. The first light of day crawled over the fever trees, turning the still dark pools into sheets of gold. Frogs called in scattered notes, insects whispered in the reed beds, and the air carried that quiet, fragile music only found after hardship. The herd woke in layers. Mothers shifted their weight. Waking calves curled beneath their bellies. Daka, the young bull, had already stepped away from the sleeping crescent, climbing to the ridge to test the air. The night had passed without incident. The lions had faded into the dark, their roars rolling farther and farther away like receding thunder. Maru still stood on the highest ground, his vast frame silhouetted against a pale sky. He closed his eyes briefly, listening to the land's breathing. To the west, a wall of cloud was stacking itself blue-black and heavy, like stone slabs laid one upon another. The wind that touched his ears was damp and weighty, carrying the crushed green scent of bruised leaves. Maru knew this weather. It wasn't rumor. It was consequence. Somewhere upstream, the sky would split, and rivers that had been dust for months would remember their shape. This oasis, this deep bowl of claywood filled quickly, and if they weren't careful, it could just as easily become a trap. Omen of the coming rain, he rumbled a low order through the ground. Drink, feed quickly, be ready to move. The matriarchs caught it instantly. Calves hurried down to the shallows, dipping their trunks with messy enthusiasm. Mothers drank deeply, then showered their flanks with arcs of water to cool the heat stored from the salt pan crossing. Daka held his post at the reed margin, eyes fixed on the water where last night's crocodile still lay disguised as a log. By mid-morning the wind had teeth. It hissed through the reeds, bending them in uneasy waves. A line of white egrets fought to stay aloft, then broke and veered toward the shelter of the fever trees. Across the water, the surface puckered, then stilled completely as if something had pressed a giant hand upon it and told it to listen. The first thunder arrived, as weight before sound. The ground gave a small, rounded shiver. Then, half a breath later, the drum node rolled in, followed by a jagged white flash tearing the horizon. The air was suddenly rich wet earth, leaf mold, the metallic temps of rain yet to fall. Maru planted his feet deeper into the clay and knew the flood would come fast. If the basin's throat could not drain quickly enough, it would drown. Pulling to higher ground, he led them away from the water's edge, up the slope east of the fever trees, where an ancient termite mound crowned a gentle ridge. From here, the entire oasis lay in view. The mothers shielded their calves as the rain began, first in slow, heavy coins, then a curtain thick enough to blur the far shore. It drummed on their backs, washing away the dust of the journey. Calves first reveled in the cool, then pressed themselves under their mothers, when lightning cracked above and thunder followed instantly, loud enough to shiver the skin. The oasis transforms below. The water was no longer still. Runoff from the hills streamed into the basin, turning trickles into rushing mouths. 3 separate pools merged into one restless body, the reeds trembling with the push of water beneath. Logs and branches spun in lazy circles before being caught and pulled toward the deeper middle. The fever tree leaned slightly, its roots bracing against the new current. The crocodile slid away from the shallows, disappearing into dark water with only a faint ripple. Maru tested the clay at the slope's base. It was softening fast. He stepped back. If they stayed too low, the water could cut off their exit within an hour. When the river wakes by midday, the storm had gathered its full voice. From the west came a sound like applause building into a roar. The old river was waking, rushing down from higher ground in a steady, tireless surge. It entered the basin not as a crashing wall, but as a relentless muscle, widening and deepening with every passing minute. Maru moved the herd with precision. Calves in the center, old cows anchoring the slip-prone flanks, Daka patrolling the reed margin. Orders came in deep rumbles that cut through the rain. The herd shifted as one, as if tied together by invisible rope. Guests of the storm, the rain drew other lives to the water. A dazzle of zebra picked their way to the bank, snorting at the scent of elephants but drinking anyway. Wildebeest funneled into the northern inlet, wary but desperate. Even a herd of buffalo arrived at the far side, lowering their heads in unison to drink from a calmer pool. Only the lions stayed away. They lingered in the mist beyond sight, but none dared approach a herd so tightly bound and alert. The storm breaks by late afternoon. The thunder grew more distant. The rain softened from a silver wall to a light scatter of drops, then to the lazy patter of water falling from leaves. The basin, swollen now into a wide stretch of moving river, no longer churned with violence, but flowed with steady intent. Fish flashed beneath the surface. Frogs sang in jubilant, overlapping choruses. Maru allowed the herd to approach for another drink, but the defensive wall remained. Mothers formed a living barricade, while calves waded into the shallows. Daka stood downstream, scanning for the ripple of a predator beneath the new current. Evening beside the new river. As the sun sank, the sky shed the last of the storm clouds, revealing a deep, clean blue. The surface of the river blazed with gold and copper, mirroring the day's last light. The air was heavy with the sense of wet soil and fresh growth of perfume the land had not worn in many months. The herd chose to camp on the ridge. From here, they could watch the water's path and feel the wind carry any warning. Calves curled at their mother's feet, lulled by the river's low, constant voice. Maru stood a while longer. The journey had been long days of thirst, nights of danger, the cruel heat of the salt pan, but here was proof that endurance had meaning. The drought had ended, the river had returned, and life was stitching itself back into the fabric of the land. Tomorrow, they would decide whether to follow the river downstream or linger. But tonight, they had something rare, peace, and the music of water flowing where it had been silent too long. The river sang through the night, its voice low and patient, filling the air with a rhythm the herd had not heard in months. The frogs' chorus rose in bursts, crickets threaded between their notes, and now and then, a fish broke the surface with a slap. The moon rode high, silvering the fever trees and painting the elephants in a soft, otherworldly light. Maru stood on the ridge, not sleeping. The old bull's eyes swept the water, the far grassland, the shadows under the trees. Every so often, his left foreleg trembled, a tiny shiver that he ignored, but could not entirely hide. His body carried the weight of years, of long marches across heat and hunger, of every fight survived. Yet here he was, still the pillar the herd leaned upon. When dawn broke, it found the herd calm and fed. Mist lifted from the river's skin, revealing fresh tracks along the banks. Buffalo, warthog, and antelope had come in the night to drink. The lion's scent lingered faintly on the wind, but far off, softened by distance. For the first time in a long while, the danger was not immediate. The first sign it began as they were moving downstream. The plan was to follow the river's course for 2 days, keeping close to water while the land renewed itself. Grass would regrow in the soaked soil. Young shoots would feed the mothers. The calves would gain weight. But barely an hour into the march, Maru slowed. His stride shortened, his breathing deepened. At first, no one noticed. The herd's rhythm had always matched his, and they slowed with him without thinking. But on a rise above a bend in the river, Daka glanced back, and saw the truth. The leader's shoulders carried a weight that was not just age, but something heavier. Maru stopped at the ridge's crest and stood, sides heaving slightly. He looked out over the river and the plains beyond, not as a scout marking the next move, but as one memorizing a view. His trunk lowered, brushing the ground. The young bull approached, but Maru's head tilted just enough to say, "Not yet." The lion's shadow returns. They found the pride again before midday. The herd was skirting a shallow backwater when a ripple passed through the grass ahead. Then another, lower, heavier. A lioness rose into view, eyes narrow against the sun. Behind her, 2 more forms moved, their shoulders rolling in a slow, confident rhythm. Farther back, in the mottled shade of a thorn tree, a mane caught the light. These were not the hesitant stalkers of the ambush days before. They were well fed, now rested, certain, and that made them dangerous in a different way. Lions who are not starving will still hunt if they see advantage, but they can afford patience. Testing the herd for cracks, Maru's gaze swept the herd's formation. The mothers were in place, calves in the center, flanks held by strong cows. Daka took his position to the right, but his eyes kept flicking to Maru. The old bull's stance was steady, but the tremor in his leg was visible now when the light caught it. The lions shadowed them for nearly an hour, just close enough to keep tension alive. Every so often, a lioness would drift ahead, crouching low, only to melt back into the grass. It was a performance, probing, measuring, waiting, testing the young bull. It happened when the river bent sharply around a thicket. A narrow strip of firm ground between the water and the thorn was the only path forward. It was the perfect choke point, too narrow for the whole herd to pass quickly, just wide enough for a predator to strike. From the far side, a lioness stepped into view, her body low but unhurried. A second appeared on the flank, and a third burst from the thicket behind them, cutting off retreat. The herd tightened instinctively. Maru stepped forward, but then paused. His eyes went to Daka, and in that brief silence, something passed between them. It was not an order, not quite. It was an invitation and a test. Daka understood. He moved to the front, his body filling the narrow way, tusks angled forward, his ears spread wide, catching the light, and he let out a low, steady rumble that vibrated through the ground. The calves huddled closer. The mothers shifted subtly to give him room without breaking the wall. The first lioness made her play. She feinted left, trying to draw him into a step that would open his side. But Daka had watched Maru for too long to fall for it. He held position, turning just enough to deny her the angle. When she realized she wouldn't move him, she backed into the grass with a flick of her tail. The second came harder, rushing the line in a spray of dust. Daka met her with a short, explosive, charged 3 steps, enough to make her skid sideways into the water's edge. She snarled, hissed, and retreated, soaked and furious. The third never committed at all. She had seen enough. The shift when the lions finally melted away into the tall grass, the herd moved on. But this time, it was Daka who walked point. The change felt natural. Unforced Maru still just behind him, the silent anchor. That night, they camped on a high bank above the river, the water whispering below. The herd rested easily, calves asleep in a tangle of trunks and legs. Daka took first watch, standing where the moonlight turned his shoulders silver. Maru stayed awake too, though he lay on his side, the weight of the day pressing deep into the earth beneath him. He watched the young bull, how he stood without shifting, how his ears turned to every sound, how his gaze swept the dark without rest. It was not the stance of a restless youth anymore. It was the stance of someone who had begun to understand that leadership was not about glory, it was about the work of keeping others alive. The morning after the next morning, Maru rose slowly. The tremor in his leg was worse, but he said nothing. When the herd formed to move out, Daka naturally took the front again. Maru followed close, his shadow still touching the young bulls, but the shift in weight was clear now to all. The river kept them company as they traveled, its voice growing softer where it widened into shallows. Birds followed in their wake, egrets stepping in the grass, beaters flashing like green sparks over the water. The land smelled of promise. For Maru, each step was both familiar and strange. He had led for so long that the rhythm of command was part of his bones. But now, the rhythm was changing. The map in his mind, built over decades, was being passed, piece by piece, into another's keeping. That night, as the herd settled under a wide sky stitched with stars, Maru stood beside Daka and touched his trunk lightly to the young bull's brow. It was not ceremony, not a speech, just a mark, a quiet line drawn in the dust between them. "It is your turn now." The river murmured below, carrying the sound away into the dark. Somewhere beyond the bend, new trials waited. And for the first time in many seasons, Maru knew he did not have to meet them alone. The river had been their companion for days now, a living ribbon guiding the herd across the renewed Savannah. It had fed them green shoots along its banks, water deep and clean enough to sustain them without fear of thirst. But it had also grown restless. The upstream rains that had filled the oasis had not stopped. They had traveled down the river's spine, thickening its current, widening its reach. By the 7th day since the storm, the river was no longer a calm, patient guide. It had become a barrier. The herd stood on a high embankment, staring down at a stretch where the river swelled into a broad, roiling expanse. On the far side lay higher ground, a corridor of acacia and mopane that Maru knew well it would lead them toward a region of seasonal pools, the next stage in their journey. But there was no bridge of shallows here, no easy ford. The only way forward was through. The measure of the current. Daka stood at the front now, his ears catching the wind, his eyes fixed on the far bank. The water below was the color of churned clay, flecked with floating debris, branches, reeds, and once the pale flash of a zebra carcass swept away from somewhere upstream. The sound of it was a continuous, muscular growl. Maru limped forward, standing beside the young bull. He dipped his trunk toward the water, drawing in the scent. Beneath the mud and silt was the sharp, ancient smell of crocodile. They were out there, holding position against the current, waiting for any animal that entered clumsily or in panic. Daka glanced sideways at him, searching for guidance, but Maru did not give an order. Instead, he simply looked into the younger bull's eyes and let the silence speak. You lead them now. Your decision will carry them or lose them. The first steps Daka turned to the herd. His rumble was deep, steady, not as resonant as Maru's, but with its own youthful authority. The matriarchs shifted, tightening the formation around the calves. Older bulls moved to the flanks. The strongest swimmers would enter first, breaking the current's surface, so the others could follow in their wake. He stepped into the water without hesitation. The cold struck him, first cold from the deep places upstream, from rain shadowed under clouds for days before spilling free. The current shoved at his legs, pressing against his chest, demanding he yield. He leaned into it, each step deliberate, feeling for the riverbed through the shifting silt. The first matriarch followed, her calf pressed close against her side. Behind her, another mother entered, then two more, each placing themselves where Daka's broad back broke the water's force. The midstream trial halfway across, the river's voice deepened. The current here was faster, the bottom uneven. Daka felt the ground drop suddenly away beneath his forefeet. He was swimming now, the weight of his head and tusks pulling downward. He kicked hard, lifting his trunk high to breathe, and angled slightly upstream to counter the drift. A calf cried out behind him. Daka spun his head just enough to see one of the youngest swept sideways, its mother struggling to hold position in the deeper water. Without thinking, he pushed toward them, driving his body between the calf and the downstream pull. He nudged the small one forward with his trunk, matching the mother's stroke until they regained the safer line behind the matriarchs. But the delay had cost him. A dark shape slid toward him from upstreams, smooth, unbroken, the water bulging slightly over its length. Crocodile. It was coming fast, carried by the current but steering with its tail. The fight in the water. Daka didn't retreat. He angled toward it, thrusting his head forward, ears tight against his skull. At the last moment, he struck with his tusk knot, a killing blow, but enough to force the crocodile to roll and lose momentum. The predator slid past, vanishing into the churn, unwilling to spend more energy against a herd in full defense. The encounter had scattered the front line. Daka blew a sharp trumpet short, commanding, pulling the swimmers back into formation. Slowly, the herd's shape reformed, a living wedge cutting across the river. The far bank, the water shallowed suddenly, the riverbed rising beneath their feet. The first matriarch climbed out, her calf scrambling up beside her, dripping and wide-eyed. One by one, the others followed, hooves finding purchase on the muddy slope. Daka emerged, last of the leaders, chest heaving, his hide streaked with silt and weed. He turned immediately to count, his eyes scanning each calf, each mother. All were there, no one lost. On the bank above, Maru stood waiting. The old bull's eyes met his, and for a moment, the sound of the river faded. No words passed, no gesture was needed. The approval in that gaze was enough to fix the moment forever in Daka's memory. The rest on higher ground, they moved a short distance inland to a rise scattered with thorn trees. There, the herd rested, calves lying in the shade, while mothers grazed on the first tender shoots of new grass. The river was still within sight, its restless surface catching the late sun, but now it was behind them. Maru lay down for the first time in days. The tremor in his leg eased as he folded himself into the dust. He watched Daka patrolling the perimeter, checking the wind, noting every movement in the grass. The young bull was still learning, but today he had led them through teeth and current, through the hardest test the river could give, and he had brought them all across. A leader's quiet acknowledgement. When the sun dipped low and the herd began to feed in the open, Maru rose slowly and walked to Daka's side. He touched his trunk to the younger bull's shoulder, a gesture, small enough to go unnoticed by the others, but heavy with meaning. Then he stepped back, letting Daka walk ahead as the herd began to move again. The river's growl softened with distance. Ahead lay the corridor of green that would lead them deeper into the wet season's bounty. Behind them, the flood crossing would become a story calves would hear in low rumbles for years, and in the quiet between their steps, the baton of leadership passed not with ceremony, but with the weight of trust, carried forward on strong, unshaken legs.